February 3, 2020. A call came out of nowhere to the Putnam County Sheriff. Sheriff Howard Sills was on the line, and from the other side, an officer with the Eatonton, Georgia Police Department, Seth, dropped the bombshell, saying that his wife Amanda had committed suicide. When the officers arrived at Seth's house, Seth was sitting on the front steps, face buried in his hands. And inside, they found her body. But something about the scene was off. She was lying flat on her back, legs almost together, arms at her sides, hands cupped, as if she'd been placed by someone there. It didn't look like how you'd imagine someone after a suicide. Even the investigators who'd seen it all couldn't shake how strange it felt. The question that haunted them was when they interrogated Seth. He painted a different picture of a tragic argument. He said they had been fighting in bed, and suddenly she said, "I can't do this anymore," before taking her own life. But doesn't it sound odd? He kept saying he loved her, that she was his world, swearing up and down that he had nothing to do with it, and he leaned hard on his badge as if that alone proved his innocence. But her family wasn't buying it, not for a second. They believed Seth had killed her. But even the medical examiner's report said it was a simple suicide. So that should have been the end of it. But it didn't. Why? How did Amanda Perrault actually die? Was it suicide or murder? And who killed her? Let's find the answers. Seth Perrault was the kind of a man who had greed for power. Someone who wore a badge to control instead of to protect. On the outside, he was a law enforcement officer, a respectable guy working under the district attorney's office. But behind those closed doors, it was all a different scenario, full of fright and abuse. Apparently, his wife Amanda died with a gunshot to the head. But here's the kicker. When he described it to the investigators, he used this weird phrase, saying he watched Amanda execute herself. The phrase gave everyone chills and made them question his story even more. Angie and Alicia, Amanda's sisters, never believed the suicide story at all. They said Amanda was full of life, so there was no way she would just end it like that. Plus, they felt like they had been losing Amanda for years. When she and Seth got together, it was like he pulled her away from them. Over their 8-year relationship, things got terribly bad. Seth was controlling and domineering, which made Amanda more and more isolated. But how did they meet each other in the first place? It was 2011 back then, 2 years after Amanda had divorced. She met this guy, Seth, on the internet. All seemed to be going well in the beginning, but Seth was fighting cancer and out of work when he moved in with her just 6 months later. And after that, Amanda became his caretaker. And Seth? He began calling all the shots. Amanda could do nothing, did not have a car, and wasn't even allowed to possess her own phone. She stopped attending family get-togethers, and she was confined to her house, preparing meals for Seth's relatives. In short, it felt as if her world was shrinking gradually. In 2017, they got married. Amanda's sisters always thought it was a strategic move on Seth's part because he was in this custody battle for his daughter. Sure enough, not long after tying the knot, Seth won custody. Then they moved into this house near Lake Oconee, which Seth's dad bought for them. You'd think that would be a fresh start. But nope, their married life was quite heart-wrenching to imagine. When sober, they appeared to be an intimate couple. However, after drinking alcohol, everything turned dark. The fights became more frequent and nasty and worried everyone around them. One neighbor even described an appalling incident where Seth dragged Amanda by her hair and shoved her into the driveway. Amanda herself had warned people, on 2 separate occasions no less, that if she ever turned up dead, Seth would be the one responsible. She even begged them to push for a homicide investigation if it happened. Sadly, no one called the cops because, well, Seth was a cop, and people were scared of what he might do. Because Seth had always been a bit of a control freak, and the suspicious nature of Amanda's death brought up more questions than answers. To say their relationship was rocky would be a gross understatement. Rather, it was a ticking time bomb. And it only went downhill after Seth suffered an accident that had him off on medical leave about a year into his work with the police. He fell down the stairs in their house. That brought prescription painkillers into their lives, mixed with alcohol to create an even more explosive situation. Amanda's sisters became aware of the cracks in their relationship. They could hear Seth yelling in the background during phone calls, his voice sharp and aggressive. So many times one of them offered to step in and call the police, but Amanda dismissed it, saying that it was only drunken fights that would blow over. But her family knew that things were going out of control. The breaking point came on January 28, 2020, just a few days before Amanda's death. That night, Amanda finally called 911, her voice trembling with panic. She told the operator she had locked herself in a bedroom to escape Seth's anger. Later, she called one of her sisters, explaining how she'd fled to a neighbor's house after Seth turned violent and locked her out while she was trying to grab her things. It gets even creepier. One of the sheriff's dispatchers, knowing Seth worked as an officer for the Eatonton Police Department, made an eerie comment. They said Seth had a reputation and hinted that his violent behavior was no secret. The whole thing leaves you wondering, how many red flags were ignored before it was too late? That day, it ended with Seth getting arrested for family violence, which hit local news. Shaken and scared, Amanda turned to her sister and begged her to help, stating she wanted to leave the next morning. Before sunrise, however, Amanda had a change of heart. Instead of leaving, she showed up at Seth's bond hearing. The judge allowed her to put a stay-away order in place, but Amanda said no, letting Seth come back home. Her sisters later explained why. Amanda felt trapped, under pressure to patch things up with him. She was terrified of what his anger could bring and convinced herself that fixing their broken relationship was the only option. His public arrest only made things worse. Seth faced both the loss of his job and custody of his daughter. That seemed to make his anger even more threatening. Amanda's family grew more worried with every passing day. One of her sisters came by to visit shortly after Seth got out. Amanda said he'd been surprisingly kind, but that instead of reassuring her, the alarm bells clanged louder for her family. They were sure that his calm was just a cover for a storm brewing underneath. The arrest and public shame had seriously dented Seth's pride. Amanda wasn't blind to the danger. She admitted she was scared and felt completely stuck. Her family begged her to leave, just grab what she needed and go. Cut ties, protect herself, and start fresh. But her response sent chills through them. "I'm not trying to get killed." And just 5 days later, Amanda was gone. Their worst fears had come true. Sheriff Howard Sills had a nagging feeling something was off when he arrived at the crime scene. It started when he walked into the house. There was just something that didn't add up, and it didn't in Amanda's body either. And then, of course, there was the gun, a Smith & Wesson .380 pistol that belonged to Seth. It was lying near Amanda's left foot, but the magazine was over by her right side. That alone made Sills raise an eyebrow. How could Amanda have ejected the magazine and then somehow moved the gun to where it ended up if she'd been the one to shoot herself? It just didn't add up. With a semi-automatic like that, when you fire, the slide comes back, pushing out the spent cartridge and getting the next round ready to go. The bullet had to still be in the chamber, which means the magazine had been removed after the gun had gone off. And you don't accidentally remove a magazine, you have to press a button to do so, which takes effort. The thing is, Amanda's hands had no blood on them. Neither did the sleeves of her shirt. So Sills wasn't buying that she could have done all that herself. Then there was the green towel in the closet. It was damp, like someone had just used it. And one of the deputies pointed out that Seth smelled like shampoo. Not exactly what you'd expect after something like this had supposedly happened. To top it off, the bedroom floor was littered with about 20 empty mini bottles of Fireball whiskey. Looked like a serious drinking binge had gone down. All these weird details were enough for Sills to bring in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. He really wanted professionals to take the evidence and send off Amanda's body to the state medical examiner. Sills turned his attention to Seth, who came into the sheriff's office on his own. No lawyer, nothing. Right off the bat, Seth said he had no reason to lie. They started asking him about the gun, like how the magazine got ejected and where exactly the gun was about Amanda's body. At first, Seth denied even touching the gun, but then his story shifted. He said he might have over Amanda at some point, maybe in pain or something, but he was extremely vague about it. Sills got the feeling that Seth was hiding something. Seth kept repeating, "I am a good officer," rather than telling what really happened. Then Seth told her that Amanda lied when she made that 911 call. He said she's remorseful about it to the point that she even confessed to making false accusations against him. He told Sills that she had already written a statement to take back her words, and even led him to where this confession could be found. However, they checked on this issue. This proved to be another inconsistency in the story of Seth. Every new piece of information only made his story seem less believable. Eventually, they did find a handwritten letter on Amanda's nightstand. It said, "I, Amanda Perrault, would like to retract my statement. My husband never put his hands on me, ever. I feel horrible for the humiliation I caused my husband and family. I am willing to take any punishment I may deserve for what I have done." Amanda's sisters were convinced Seth had coached her to write a letter that would make him look innocent. According to them, he had probably told her what to say to keep him out of trouble. Seth, on the other hand, claimed that Amanda had written the letter herself, but never sent it. He said she was drowning in guilt and in her despair took his gun and ended her life. He even described her final words of apology for all the trouble she had caused him. Seth believed that guilt over a 911 call was what pushed Amanda to take such a drastic step, but Sheriff Sills couldn't believe this. He kept digging and found something real soon. It all started when Deputy Terrell Avery came to the home of Seth and Amanda to deliver paperwork. He rang his doorbell, featured by a camera, and waited. However, he could hear heavy footsteps on the inside, but no one came to the door. Eventually, after standing around for 7 minutes, he just gave up and left the papers there. Later, Sheriff Sills worked the puzzle out. He came to believe that perhaps Amanda might already have been dead when the doorbell rang and Seth was inside, trying to figure out his next move. Maybe in fright, Seth panicked, scrambled, and staged the scene. So it seems that Seth's lawyer, Justin Kenny, tried to spin things that way to make them sound more to Seth's advantage. He claimed Seth freaked out because he thought the papers Amanda handed him might have been about a custody battle. Apparently, Seth decided to lie down to cool off and ended up falling asleep. When he woke up, Amanda was mumbling something, and then she shot herself. That's Kenny's version anyway. He also mentioned the fact that Amanda was completely intoxicated, meaning that she had 3 times the limit amount of blood alcohol, and insinuated that their troubled marriage might have been a catalyst for her actions. But Sheriff Sills was not impressed. The sheriff couldn't understand how Amanda had even been able to take out the magazine, place the muzzle beneath her chin, and pull the trigger with such accuracy. Then, upon further investigation, it was revealed that Seth allegedly didn't call 911 when Amanda shot herself. Instead, he called his boss, who was the chief of police in Eatonton. Seth had a 20-minute conversation with him before it even occurred to him to dial for help. Then came the surveillance footage. It completely poked holes in Seth's story. He said they only went to a nearby convenience store, but the video showed them at a liquor store 12 miles away. He captured Amanda buying 20 tiny bottles of Fireball whiskey. And Seth? He was walking around the store in a Pink Floyd t-shirt and black athletic pants. Fast forward some hours when deputies arrived at the house, and here's Seth in totally different clothes, shorts and a dark t-shirt. And the clothes he had on in the video, the Pink Floyd t-shirt and black athletic pants, were in the washing machine, bone dry, and obviously hadn't been washed. Seth said that he was in a bath, but there was just a damp towel on the closet floor. See, none of these things seem normal. Still, Seth's lawyer came up with a defense that said it was absolutely normal to change clothes after a bath. He even said that it seemed like the washing machine had just been used as a laundry basket. They only found a speck of blood on Seth's pants and some traces of gunpowder on his left hand. And here's the thing. The tests were 2 hours after the fact, so they could have been contaminated by then. They never tested Amanda's hands, and they didn't even fingerprint the gun. Even with these holes in the case, Sheriff Sills still thought there was enough to make an arrest. Just 2 days after Amanda's death, Seth was taken into custody, But before they could present everything to a grand jury, COVID hit and shut down the courts. Seth stayed in jail for almost 9 months until the medical examiner's autopsy report came out, which ruled Amanda's death as a suicide. But the investigation kept pointing to something weird. There was no gunpowder residue around the gunshot wound, which suggested the gun was pressed right against her head when it went off. The lack of signs of a struggle made people question whether Amanda would have just let someone put a gun to her head without fighting back. However, to Justin Kenny, it was a light case win. Then there came November 3, 2020, and Seth had spent nearly 9 months behind bars and hadn't even been formally charged. The grand jury finally met to decide whether there was enough evidence on the charge to go to a trial when COVID restrictions were lifted. In their defense, they used the autopsy report as their main argument, saying it proved that Amanda's death was suicidal. However, when crime scene photos were produced, when past allegations of domestic abuse were reported, and the rest of the evidence piled up, the grand jury returned an indictment against Seth for malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Seth pleaded not guilty, of course. In February 2022, Seth decided not to testify, and his defense lawyer insisted that there was simply not enough hard evidence of Seth's involvement in Amanda's death. But the prosecutors were not giving up. They presented crime scene photos with arrows marking the location of Amanda's body and where the gun was found, as well as footage of Deputy Avery visiting the Perrault home and Seth's entire interview with Sheriff Sills. Then there was Amanda's cell phone. They found a video on it from a few months before her death, where she said, "I'm done," and made it clear she was leaving Seth. On top of that, there were photos of Amanda showing signs of past abuse, and some texts she'd sent her sisters talked about Seth choking her and giving her a busted lip. They also brought in testimony from Seth's 8-year-old daughter, who described a violent fight between her parents, saying Seth had been physical with Amanda. The defense attempted to argue that there was no direct proof Seth killed Amanda, but the jury was hit with a bunch of mixed stories and clear signs that their relationship was seriously troubled. Amanda had also warned her daughter that if Seth lost custody, he might kill her, which just added to the tension. Things only got more complicated after the prosecution called the 10-year-old daughter to testify. She swore she couldn't recall a thing about the day of the tragedy or anything she'd said in that first interview. Onlookers in the courtroom believe she came across as nervous, glancing over at her dad often and picking her words with care. Wanting to mess it up, she seemed. The defense seized on that angle and asked if she had received coaching. She said no. But then the focus switches to a new prosecution witness. Jailhouse informant Jack Falk, who'd been locked up in the same block as Seth. He's got some interesting things to say. 3 weeks before the release of the medical examiner's report, Falk, a man with a pretty expansive criminal record, decided to come forward with a few crucial details about Amanda's death, because Seth had spilled the beans on him. According to Falk, Seth was super worried about being caught on camera wearing clothes that could tie him to the crime. He also claimed Seth admitted to giving Amanda painkillers all day long, which knocked her out cold. In 2 handwritten letters, Falk continued to say Seth must have held a gun to Amanda's head while she was unconscious, and further described how he thought Seth was either behind or just beside her when the shot was fired. Of course, the defense didn't buy any of this. They brought up Falk's criminal past, saying he had every reason to make up this story. They promoted the idea that the cause could have been suicide because maybe Amanda just couldn't take the guilt anymore for accusing Seth of assault. There was some physical evidence that seemed to back them up, such as the amount of gun residue on Seth's left hand being minimal and only a speck of blood on his clothes. However, there was one thing that didn't fit: the positioning of Amanda's body. Her arms were neatly at her sides, which didn't make sense for someone who had shot themselves. Seth had a story about that, though. When he was talking to Sheriff Sills, he admitted to touching Amanda's body, maybe when he found her, possibly even holding her. The defense also tried to use that to explain why her arms were positioned that way. Then there's the issue of the gun by Amanda's side. The defense called in an expert who testified that the gun had some imperfection. The magazine ejected without a human touch after a few rounds fired in the test. He thought maybe that explained why the magazine was found next to her body. Sills, though, tested the same gun, didn't find the problem, and went back to testify the opposite. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation also screened it and found nothing wrong with it, which practically dismissed the defense's argument. After almost 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Finally, Seth Perrault was found guilty of life without the chance of parole. A verdict neither Seth nor his laywayer Kenny could believe. But what do you think? Was it a wrongful verdict? Is there a chance that Seth was innocent? Or do you think it's none but Seth who did the cold-blooded murder of his wife? Share your thoughts in the comments.